Let me ask you something. Have you ever been ghosted by someone you cared about deeply, only to have them show up weeks or months later with a, how have you been? If you're nodding right now, you're not alone. In fact, it happens so often, it's almost predictable, especially when you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. Now here's the truth that's going to shift your entire mindset. 90% of avoidants break no contact, but not because they've suddenly realized you're their soulmate, not because they've worked on themselves, and not because they're ready to love you the way you deserve. They break no contact because of you. Not what you did wrong, but what you did right after they left. See, avoidants crave space. They run from emotional intensity. The moment they feel engulfed, they retreat. But here's where it gets interesting. When you stop chasing, when you go quiet, when you focus on yourself, that silence, it becomes deafening to them. And eventually they come back, not always with flowers, sometimes with a casual, "I was just thinking about you," sometimes with, "I miss us," and sometimes with confusion, regret, or even jealousy. But here's the secret. They don't return because they're ready. They return because they're triggered by your growth, by your peace, by your detachment. An avoidant expects you to wait. They expect the anxious partner to stay stuck, obsessed, overthinking, hoping. But the moment you don't, the moment you choose healing over hoping, they feel it. And their ego can't handle that. Let's be clear, this isn't about playing games. It's about understanding human behavior. Avoidants don't come back because they've become secure. They come back because something changed, and usually that something is you. Maybe you finally stopped begging. Maybe you stopped sending long emotional texts. Maybe you stopped trying to prove your worth to someone who kept testing it. And in that shift, you became a mirror. A reflection of everything they ran from. Commitment, closeness, vulnerability. But now it's on your terms. Because once you've learned to calm your anxious mind, you stop settling for breadcrumbs. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop mistaking their return for a promise. You start asking different questions. Not, why are they back? But, are they emotionally safe for me now? Have they done the work I had to do after they left? Do I still want this, or do I just miss who I thought they were? So yes, 90% of avoidants do break no contact. But that's not the win. The real victory is when you don't break yourself to let them back in. You don't need to punish them. You don't need to chase closure. You don't need to respond out of loneliness. You just need to know, if someone walks away from you during your most vulnerable moments, you're allowed to outgrow them during your strongest. Because love, real love, doesn't run when it's hard. It stays, it shows up, it builds, not breaks. Trust. So the next time that message shows up, you won't see it as fate. You'll see it as a test. And this time, you'll pass. Avoidants often return not out of love, but because your silence unsettles them. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in attachment-based relationships. When someone with an avoidant attachment style breaks off contact, it can feel final, cold, and confusing to the anxious partner. They disappear with little to no explanation, sometimes in the middle of what felt like emotional closeness. But what the anxious person doesn't realize in that moment is that their silence is not just a reaction to rejection, it's also a powerful trigger for the avoidant. In the beginning, the avoidant feels a sense of relief after cutting ties. They believe space will bring peace. They crave distance because intimacy feels overwhelming, even threatening. They convince themselves that disappearing will help them reset, regain control, and avoid vulnerability. But something unexpected starts to happen as time passes. The silence they once craved begins to echo. The peace they wanted becomes discomfort, and slowly, that space they created starts to feel like abandonment to them too. Not because they're ready to love deeply, but because your absence becomes a mirror. It forces them to confront emotions they tried to escape. When you go silent, when you stop reaching out, when you resist the urge to beg for clarity, the avoidant loses the validation they were used to receiving. They no longer feel pursued. They no longer have control over the narrative. That lack of contact disrupts their emotional safety net. Avoidants expect anxious partners to chase. They count on your emotional openness. They know the rhythm. You reach out, they pull away, and eventually you come back. It feeds their fear of closeness while still reassuring them of your presence. But when you break that cycle, you interrupt the pattern they rely on. They begin to wonder why you're no longer reacting, why you're not sending long messages or checking in, why you're not still fighting for the connection. That silence becomes louder than any words you could say. It's not your voice they miss, it's the validation. It's not always your love they miss. It's the comfort of knowing someone was emotionally available for them without demanding the same in return. And that's when they reach out, often casually, often with mixed signals. sometimes with what seems like sincerity. But if you look closely, you'll see that the return is not a decoration of emotional growth. It's not always fueled by deep reflection or change. It's often driven by discomfort, by the emotional uncertainty that your silence created. It's not love pulling them back in. It's the feeling of losing the control they once had. The absence of your energy creates a void they want to fill, not because they're ready, but because they feel the shift in power. When you were always available, they didn't have to examine themselves. But when you step back and stay silent, they're forced to feel something they usually avoid: vulnerability. That's the moment they break no contact. They might frame it as missing you, and to some degree they might. But more often, it's about restoring equilibrium in their own world. You're no longer feeding their emotional distance. You've stopped being the one holding the thread. And now they're left wondering what changed. That question doesn't lead them to take accountability. It leads them to reach out, not to connect, but to confirm. To confirm if they still have access to you. To confirm if you're still waiting. To confirm if the door is still open. But the danger here is confusing their curiosity for commitment. Their message isn't always a sign of readiness. It's often a reaction to the discomfort your silence caused. It's an attempt to soothe their own anxiety, not necessarily to meet your emotional needs. This is why understanding attachment dynamics is so important. It helps you separate intention from impulse. It shows you that not every return is meaningful. Sometimes it's just a reflex. And in that realization, you reclaim your power. You start to see the silence not as punishment, but as protection. You understand that your stillness speaks louder than your efforts ever could. You stop interpreting their return as romance and start seeing it as resistance to emotional growth. You stop needing their validation and begin trusting your peace. Because when they come back, it's not love that led them. It's the silence that made them uncomfortable. And that silence didn't just shake them. It showed you who really held the power all along. Going no contact and focusing on yourself triggers their fear of losing control. When someone with an avoidant attachment style ends communication, they often do it with the assumption that they're the ones making the final call. They believe they hold the power not just in leaving, but in being able to come back whenever they choose. They convince themselves that their absence won't change how you feel about them, that you'll still be there emotionally even if they're physically gone. They assume that your world will pause while theirs continues. But what they don't expect is for you to actually move on. They don't anticipate you turning inward and choosing yourself. That shift, where you stop fighting for the connection and begin pouring your energy into healing, is where their fear begins to rise. When you go no contact, especially after being the one who always reached out, it flips the dynamic they were comfortable in. Suddenly, they're no longer the one calling the shots. Suddenly, your silence becomes louder than your words ever were. You stop asking questions. You stop needing closure. You stop making them the center of your emotional world. The absence of attention, affection, and energy creates discomfort for the avoidant. Not because they're missing the connection in the way you might think, but because they're no longer in control of it. They feel the energy shift and don't know what to do with the uncertainty. They start to realize that your detachment means they can't rely on your emotional availability anymore. That triggers their own hidden anxieties, the very ones they spent so much time trying to suppress or ignore. Focusing on yourself sends a message they can't misinterpret. It tells them you're no longer waiting. It tells them that their behavior had consequences. It tells them that you've recognized your own worth and decided to act on it. And for someone who built their emotional safety on creating distance, that's unsettling. They don't expect the anxious partner to stop caring. They don't expect the pattern to break. When it does, it forces them to look at the control they thought they had and realize it was never as solid as they believed. They thought leaving would give them peace. But instead, your silence gives them uncertainty. And avoidants struggle deeply with uncertainty when they're not the ones controlling the narrative. As you begin to focus on yourself, through self-care, growth therapy, or even just reclaiming your time, the energy that once fed the dynamic between you begins to dissolve. What once felt like a power imbalance now starts to balance itself. You're no longer emotionally dependent on their responses. You stop seeking validation from someone who withheld it. You no longer fear losing them because you've already chosen to find yourself. That shift is powerful. And that power is felt on their end, even if they don't admit it. Because energy doesn't lie. When someone used to your constant presence suddenly becomes absent, the void is felt, whether they show it or not. Avoidants are often more aware than they let on. They might pretend not to notice your absence, but inside, the change registers. The lack of contact forces them to sit with feelings they'd rather avoid. feelings of insecurity, doubt, and even jealousy. Not because they're ready to re-engage in a healthy way, but because they can't handle the idea of you slipping away completely. They struggle with emotional intimacy, yet they also fear total disconnection. It's this contradiction that fuels their urge to return when they sense you've truly detached. Your growth becomes their discomfort. Your healing becomes their trigger, and your silence becomes their loss of control. This is why focusing on yourself is not just about healing, it's about breaking a cycle. It's about refusing to participate in a dynamic where your emotions are constantly dictated by someone else's emotional unavailability. It's about showing yourself that your peace doesn't have to depend on someone else's confusion, and while they may come back eventually, it won't be because they've changed. It will be because you have. Because you stopped trying to pull them closer and started walking away. Because you stopped accepting inconsistency and started setting boundaries. Because you chose clarity over chaos, peace over patterns, and self-respect over the need to be chosen. That's when the avoidant feels their control slipping. That's when they realize they're not the only one who gets to decide how the story ends. Most avoidants expect anxious partners to wait. Your growth challenges that. In the dynamic between an avoidant and an anxious partner, there's often an unspoken agreement, a predictable rhythm that both fall into without realizing it. The avoidant pushes away, creates distance, withdraws emotionally or physically, and the anxious partner follows, reaches out, seeks reassurance, and tries to fix what feels broken. This cycle becomes so familiar that even when it causes pain, both people feel strangely safe within it. The avoidant feels in control because they know the anxious partner will wait. They rely on that loyalty, that emotional consistency, that sense of being needed without having to reciprocate at the same depth. They know that even after long silences or confusing behavior, there's a high chance the anxious partner will still be there, ready to reconnect the moment they return. This expectation is not always conscious, but it is deeply ingrained. Avoidants often mistake the anxious partner's patience for permanence. They think they'll wait. They always do. And for a while that might be true. The anxious partner, driven by hope, fear of abandonment, and a longing for connection, often gives chance after chance. They analyze every detail, replay conversations, wonder what went wrong, and convince themselves that love means staying. Even when it hurts, the avoidant sees this and begins to build a false sense of emotional safety. Not the kind that comes from intimacy and mutual understanding, but the kind that comes from believing they'll never truly lose you. It feeds their avoidance even more. Why face hard conversations or change their behavior if they believe you'll always be there? But everything changes when the anxious partner begins to grow, when they stop prioritizing the relationship over their own peace, when they finally get tired of waiting for someone to show up in the way they need, when they start going inward instead of outward. This growth is subtle at first. Maybe it looks like responding slower to messages or not initiating conversations as often. Maybe it shows up in boundaries, in quiet strength, in less emotional reactivity. Eventually, it becomes undeniable. The anxious partner begins to detach, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. That's when the avoidant starts to feel the difference. They reach out and don't get the same response. They sense the emotional gap widening. But this time, it's not because they created it. It's because the anxious partner no longer feels safe closing it. This growth is powerful. It rewrites the script. The avoidant no longer feels secure in their assumption that you'll always wait. They can't rely on your forgiveness like they used to. They can't count on your presence to soothe their emotional distance. Your evolution begins to dismantle the dynamic that gave them comfort. You've stopped playing your part in the old pattern, and that forces them to confront something they've avoided for so long, the reality that someone who loves deeply can also walk away. It challenges their belief that distance guarantees safety. It shows them that emotional unavailability isn't a shield from loss. It's a path to it. When the anxious partner starts healing, they begin to see their own patterns too. They recognize how often they've overextended themselves. They understand how much of their identity was tied to being needed. And they begin to reclaim parts of themselves that were sacrificed in the pursuit of connection. That transformation is not just personal. It sends a shockwave through the dynamic. The avoidant who once felt they had time, space, and control suddenly feels unstable. Not because of anything aggressive or reactive, but because you're no longer assuring the connection with your emotional labor. You're no longer holding both ends of the rope. And while the avoidant may not say it, they feel it. They might reach out more. They might test the waters. They might even try to re-establish the old rhythm. But nothing feels the same because you're not the same. You're not waiting anymore. You're living, growing, and healing. Your time is no longer spent wondering when they'll come back. Your energy is no longer invested in trying to fix what wasn't yours to fix. This is the moment the avoidant realizes that the ground beneath them has shifted, that what they thought would always be there is now standing on solid ground of its own. And that realization disrupts their sense of certainty, challenging the assumptions they've carried all along. Their return is usually ego-driven, not emotionally evolved. When someone with an avoidant attachment style breaks no contact and reaches out again, it's easy to misread their return as a sign of progress, healing, or renewed love. But in most cases, the truth is far less romantic. Their decision to re-engage is often not the result of deep emotional reflection or inner transformation. It's not that they've finally realized your worth in a profound way or suddenly become capable of secure intimacy. More often, their return is triggered by their ego being disrupted, by the discomfort that arises when they no longer feel in control of your emotions. The silence they once initiated begins to feel threatening, not because they miss the relationship in a healthy way, but because the lack of response shakes their sense of dominance in the dynamic. Avoidants often operate from a place of emotional protection, keeping people at arm's length to avoid vulnerability. They don't like to feel exposed, emotionally indebted, or reliant on someone else. But when you pull away completely and stay silent, it disturbs their internal balance. They start to question what's happening, not because they're in touch with their feelings, but because they can no longer read yours. The attention they were used to receiving is gone. The anxious partner they thought would always be there isn't chasing, checking in, or reacting. That absence pokes at their ego. It creates confusion. It builds insecurity. They wonder if you've moved on, if you've stopped caring, or worse, if you've found someone else who values you in the way they never did. The ego is deeply invested in control and certainty. When that control is removed, the avoidance starts to feel off balance. They're not motivated by love, growth, or clarity. They're motivated by the desire to feel in charge again. They want to know they can still have access to you. They want to see if you'll still respond the same way, if your emotions are still available for them to tap into when they feel uncertain or lonely. This kind of return is often subtle. It might come in the form of a vague message, a random social media like a simple "hey" with no follow-up. Not direct, it's not vulnerable, it's not grounded in real accountability. It's a temperature check, it's their ego testing the waters. If you respond eagerly or emotionally, it feeds their need for reassurance without requiring them to step up emotionally. They feel validated, they feel back in control. And then, often, they retreat again. This back and forth behavior can be incredibly destabilizing for someone with an anxious attachment style. It creates a false sense of hope that maybe this time things will be different, that maybe they're finally ready. But unless real growth has taken place, their return is a reaction, not a decision. It's a response to discomfort, not a declaration of change. And this distinction matters because understanding it protects you from confusing attention with intention. An ego-driven return isn't sustainable. It's not rooted in emotional availability or maturity. It's about soothing their own anxiety, not meeting your emotional needs. They might act sweet, say the right things, even talk about missing you, but the moment they sense things are becoming emotionally intense again, they'll pull away. The same fears that drove them to avoid intimacy in the first place haven't been addressed. They're still afraid of vulnerability. They're still afraid of commitment. They're still unsure how to be emotionally present. But the difference is now they're also afraid of losing the emotional power they once held. Your silence forced them to confront that fear. It didn't make them better. It just made them react. And that reaction can look a lot like reconciliation if you're not careful. That's why it's essential to observe not just what they say when they return, but how they show up. Are they consistent? Are they emotionally available? Are they willing to take accountability? Are they doing the emotional labor they once avoided? Or are they just reaching out to feel important again? The avoidant ego is fragile. It thrives on predictability and power. When that's taken away, they seek to restore it, not because they've transformed, but because they're uncomfortable with uncertainty. And in many cases, the moment they feel reassured, they return to the same avoidant patterns. This creates a painful cycle for the anxious partner, one filled with hope, followed by disappointment, followed by confusion. But recognizing the difference between an ego-driven return and an emotionally mature one can break that cycle. It gives you the clarity to make decisions based on reality, not potential. It teaches you to look past the surface gestures and examine what's really motivating their behavior. And most importantly, it empowers you to protect your growth from someone who hasn't done the work to meet you where you are. The real power lies in your response, not their comeback. When someone who walked away decides to come back, it's easy to believe that the moment holds all the power. It feels like validation, like everything you hoped for is finally unfolding. But in truth, the moment they return is not the turning point. The real shift happens in how you choose to respond. Because their return doesn't guarantee change, healing, or love. It only shows that your absence was felt. What you do next determines whether you fall into the same cycle or break free from it. The power has never been in their hands. It's always been in yours. The choice to protect your peace, your growth, and your boundaries carries more weight than any apology or message from the past. When you've spent time healing, reflecting, and rebuilding yourself after being hurt, you start to see their return through a different lens. The version of you who was desperate for closure, attention, or reunion may have once jumped at the chance to reconnect. But the version of you that has learned self-worth understands that not every return deserves a welcome. Your growth gives you the ability to pause, to question, and to observe without being swept up in emotion. You no longer react based on old wounds, you respond from a place of clarity. That's the power they don't expect. They expect you to fall back into old patterns, to pick up where things left off. But when you don't, when you hold your ground, when you don't make their comeback the center of your universe, it disrupts the narrative they were counting on. Your response sets the tone. It communicates what you now accept and what you no longer tolerate. It shows whether you've truly outgrown the version of yourself that once accepted less than you deserved. Because sometimes the comeback is just a test, a way to see if they still have access to the parts of you that used to bend, break, and overextend. If you let them back in without question, without requiring accountability or change, the cycle repeats. But if you pause, evaluate, and prioritize your emotional safety, you reclaim the power you once gave away. Your boundaries become your filter. Your self-respect becomes your protection. You're no longer proving your worth to someone who failed to see it the first time. The avoidant often relies on emotional inconsistency to stay comfortable. They give just enough to keep you emotionally invested, but not enough to create true intimacy. When they come back and you don't play along, it shakes their sense of control. They no longer feel like they can dip in and out of your life without consequence. Your calm, measured response forces them to confront the fact that your emotional world no longer revolves around them. That's a powerful realization, not just for them, but for you. Because in that moment, you're not the one seeking answers or approval. You're the one standing still while they try to figure out why their usual moves aren't working anymore. And it's not about being cold, distant, or punishing. It's about being conscious, grounded, and intentional. It's about understanding that the power you hold doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from controlling your reaction to them. When you stop letting someone's return dictate your emotions, you reclaim the parts of yourself that were once scattered by uncertainty. You realize that their presence isn't the reward, it's your own healing. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to argue your value. You don't need to fix what they broke, because your power is no longer tied to whether they stay or go. It's tied to how deeply you've learned to stay with yourself. People who leave without accountability often return with charm instead of change. It's your job to notice the difference. When your response is based on discernment rather than desire, you protect your progress. You become someone who doesn't just survive heartbreak, but transforms through it. You become someone who doesn't just wait for someone to come back, but builds a life worth protecting, whether they return or not. The moment they come back might feel like a victory, but the real win is in how you choose to move forward, not from fear, not from loneliness, but from the strength you've built by finally choosing you. True healing means recognizing patterns, not repeating them. It's not enough to wait for time to pass or for the pain to fade. Real growth begins when you look at what hurt you, how you responded, and what choices you made from a place of fear or habit rather than awareness. When it comes to attachment dynamics, especially between avoidants and anxious partners, the pattern can feel so familiar that it almost becomes invisible. The emotional highs and lows, the pushing and pulling, the constant anxiety followed by brief relief, it becomes a cycle that feels like love but is actually survival. And until you begin to see it clearly, you will continue to repeat it, even if it's with someone new. Healing isn't just moving on. It's understanding why you stayed, what kept you hoping, and what parts of you were being activated by someone else's inconsistency. The avoidant anxious trap is one of emotional chasing. One partner avoids intimacy to protect themselves. The other clings to it to feel secure. It creates a bond that feels intense but is built on mutual wounding. Every time the avoidant pulls away, it confirms the anxious person's worst fear that love means abandonment. Every time the anxious partner reaches out, it confirms the avoidant's fear that closeness is suffocating. And around it goes, reinforcing each person's core wound. Healing means stepping out of that loop. It means taking a hard look at your own patterns and asking yourself why you were drawn to someone who made you feel unsure, why you tried so hard to earn love from someone who kept it just out of reach, why you confused inconsistency with passion and distance with mystery. Recognizing patterns means seeing your own role in the dynamic without shame, only awareness. It's not about blaming yourself, but about understanding how you coped. Maybe you grew up in a household where love was conditional, where affection was earned through performance, where silence was punishment. Maybe being ignored feels familiar. Maybe being anxious in love feels normal because it mirrors the emotional environment you were raised in. When you understand these origins, you stop personalizing someone else's avoidance. You realize that their emotional unavailability isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a pattern of theirs, and your anxious response is a pattern of yours. That moment of recognition is the doorway to healing. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how often you silence your own needs just to keep the peace. How often you tolerate uncertainty because it feels like the price of connection. How often you accept breadcrumbs because you're afraid of walking away empty-handed. But you also start to notice your power. You start setting boundaries where you used to make excuses. You start pausing where you used to chase. You start asking yourself, is this love? Or is this a reenactment of my past pain? Healing turns those automatic reactions into conscious choices. It gives you space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you find yourself. Patterns only lose power when you stop participating in them. It's not enough to understand what's happening. You have to do something different. That might mean saying no to the familiar pull of an emotionally distant partner. It might mean sitting with your own discomfort instead of reaching for someone else to soothe it. It might mean choosing solitude over a connection that drains you. These are not easy choices. They go against everything your nervous system has been trained to seek out. But they are the choices that change your life. Because each time you choose differently, you reinforce a new pattern, one based on self-trust, not self-abandonment. Healing also means being honest with yourself when the avoidant returns. It means asking, has anything really changed? Or does this just feel comfortable because it's familiar? Do I want this because it's right, or because it temporarily soothes my fear of being alone? Am I responding from my healed self, or from my wounded self? These questions don't always lead to easy answers, but they do lead to freedom. You begin to see that love shouldn't hurt more than it heals. That connection shouldn't cost your peace. That your worth isn't measured by how much pain you can endure for someone else's approval. True healing turns patterns into lessons. You don't just survive the breakup. You extract wisdom from it. You don't just get over someone, you get closer to yourself. You don't just move on, you move up. Into higher standards, deeper awareness, and more secure relationships. You no longer look for someone to complete you because you've become whole. And in that wholeness, you stop repeating what broke you. You start creating what builds you. You start loving from a place of power, not fear. You start choosing not based on wounds, but on wisdom.